Hey Muslim, do you know the story of Moses? You've likely heard the story of Moses at the mosque from your father and mother. Maybe at school, maybe you've read it yourself in the Quran. It is in chapter 28, verse 23. And I want to ask you to grab your Quran and read along with me. Then Moses came to the well of Midian. Then he found a group of men there watering their livestock. And he found 2 women beside them who were keeping their livestock from drinking. And Moses said, "What is your problem?" They said, "We cannot water the livestock until the shepherds take back their flocks." And they departed. And our father is a very old man. Then he gave water to their flock. Then he withdrew into the shade and said, "My Lord, I am truly in need of whatever good you send down to me." One of the 2 women came walking towards him shyly. She said, "My father invites you to reward you for watering our livestock." When he came to him, the father of the women, and told him the story, he said, "Do not be afraid. You have escaped from the unjust people." One of the 2 women said, "O my father, take him into service. The best man you can take into service is one who is strong and trustworthy." And he, Shuaib, said, "I wish to give you one of these 2 daughters in marriage, on the condition that you work for me for 8 years. And if you complete 10, then that is a favor from your side. And I do not wish to make it difficult for you. You will indeed find that I am, if Allah wills, among the righteous." Moses said, "This is an agreement between you and me. Whichever of the 2 terms I fulfill, no injustice will be done to me, and Allah is witness to what we say." When Moses had completed the term and departed with his family, he saw a fire from afar, in the direction of Mount Tur or Tur. He said to his family, "Stay here, and I see a fire. Perhaps I can bring you news, or at least a burning branch from the fire, so that you may warm yourselves." And when he reached it, he was called from the right side of the valley, from the blessed place in the thicket near the tree, "O Moses, I am Allah, the Lord of the worlds." So we read in this part of the Quran, we read the story of Moses who arrives in Midian at the well. And he finds a group of shepherds there watering their flock. And he finds 2 women there holding back their flock. And Moses arrives there last. He joins them there. So it's the male shepherds first, then the female shepherds who cannot water their flock. And then Moses arrives at that place. And eventually he also asks the women, "Why don't you give your flock water?" And he gives the flock of those women, he gives them water. In the Torah, the Word of God, it also speaks about the moment that Moses has to flee from Egypt because he strikes an Egyptian dead. And he flees to Midian. He flees from Egypt to Midian. And then we read the same passage, the narrative in the Torah. It says there, when Pharaoh heard of this matter, in verse 15, Exodus 2 verse 15, he wanted to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and settled in the land of Midian. And he sat by the well. Who arrives first at the well in the Torah? That is Moses. But in the Quran we just read, who comes first to the well? Those are the male shepherds. Moses comes last. But Moses fled from Pharaoh, settled in the land of Midian, and sat by the well. The priest of Midian had 7 daughters. They came to draw water and filled the troughs to give their father's flock water to drink. So Moses, can you see the story? He flees from Egypt. He arrives in Midian, he sits by the well, he sits there alone. And first the women come. And those are 7 women who give their flock water. And so they are the first to start with that. Then the shepherds came and drove them, the girls, the women, away. But Moses stood up and rescued them and gave their flock water. So in this story, the male shepherds come last. What is also a difference, Moses, he then chases the male shepherds away. And only then does he give the women's flock water. And so here we already see an important difference in the order, how things proceed, the groups described, the people described. We immediately see a change, we see a difference emerge. So my question to you is, how is that possible? If God is the author of both stories, how can it be that they change the order? Another difference we read in the story in the Quran and the Torah is that in the Quran it is clearly described that Jethro had two daughters. Two daughters, that is said 4 times in the text. And besides them, he found 2 women who were holding back their flock. And in the next part it says, then one of the 2 women came to him walking shyly, walking. In the next part, and one of the 2 women said to him, "O my father, hire him." And finally it says, he said, "I intend to give one of these 2 daughters to you in marriage." But if we compare that with the Torah, what do we see then? It says there, the priest of Midian had 7 daughters. So the Quran says that Jethro had 2 daughters. The Torah says that he had 7. Hey, but this is surprising. Because 2 and 7, that might just be a clerical error. But what is the point? In which story in the Torah do we read that someone fled, that someone sat by a spring, and that someone came to a father-in-law who had 2 daughters? That is the story of Jacob in Genesis 29. Jacob also had to flee 300 years earlier. He had to flee from Esau, who wanted to kill him, his brother. And Rebekah had told him, his mother, "Flee to my family, to Laban, to my brother." So Jacob, he flees to Haran, which is present-day southern Turkey, not Midian, the north of Arabia. They fled to a completely different place at a completely different time. And Jacob also arrives at the spring. The male shepherds are already there. Then Jacob arrives. And only then does one of Laban's daughters, his niece you could say, come to the well to draw the water. There is no quarrel there, no fight. Jacob doesn't go and stand up for Rachel there. There is simply harmony in that history. But the point is this. Laban had 2 daughters. And we see that the Quran says here 4 times, one of the 2. And that there are 2 daughters. But we read very clearly in the history of Moses in Exodus 2 that Jethro has 7 daughters. And here we begin to see something very peculiar. We see that the Quran and that Muhammad begin to mix 2 people from the Torah, namely Jacob and Moses, together. How can that be? How did that happen? Do you have an answer to that for me? So far we have seen 2 things. We have seen that the order of the people who came to the well, that it differs between the Torah and the Quran. And we have seen that the events differ. We have also seen that Jethro did not have 2 daughters, but 7. And we have seen that the history of those 2 daughters belongs to Jacob and not to Moses. There is another difference I want to show you between the Torah and the Quran. Verse 27 says, "And he, Shuaib, said, I wish to give you one of these 2 daughters in marriage, on the condition that you work for me, and only for me, for a period of 8 years. And if you complete 10, then that is a favor from your side." We read in this story from the Quran that Shuaib, Jethro, that he actually says to Moses, "I am making an agreement with you. If you serve me for 8 years or 10 years, then you will get my daughter, one of the 2 daughters. You'll get her as your wife. And you serve me those 8 to 10 years. And after that, you're free to go. And you've received the woman, you've paid the bride price, as it were." That is the story from the Quran. But if we read the story of Moses in the Torah, what do we read there? In verse 20 it says, "Call him to come and have a meal." And Moses agreed to stay and live with the man. And he gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses, and she bore him a son. We see in the history of Exodus, of Moses. We don't see that a time is agreed upon or a period to serve for the woman. But Moses, he stays with Jethro, and he gets Zipporah as a wife, and she bears him a son. Where do we see that an agreement is made about a period of service for a woman? That is again in Genesis 29, 30, 31, 32. In that history is described how Jacob enters into negotiations with Laban, his father-in-law, his future father-in-law. And Laban says, "Well, of course you don't have to work for me for nothing." And then Jacob says, "Okay, I would like to marry your youngest daughter with Rachel." "Okay," says Laban, "fine. Then you must work for her for 7 years. And that's what Jacob does. And he works 7 years, and then Laban, he plays a trick on him. Because he gives Leah on the day of the wedding, and then Jacob is deceived. And then he says, "What have you done?" to Laban. Yes, says Laban, that's what we always do here. But, if you work for me for another 7 years, then you'll get Rachel a week later too. And so it happens that Jacob works for 14 years for Laban. And after those 14 years, he has had all these sons. And Laban says, then they go into conversation again. And then Jacob works another 6 years for his flock and for all the material things he acquires there. So in total, he works 20 years for Rachel, for Leah. He also gets 2 concubines as well and a flock. And after those 20 years, he departs back to his land, to Israel. So the negotiation for service for a woman, we don't read in the history of Moses. Because Moses had the intention to stay with Jethro forever. He wasn't going to work for a period of service. Why not? He had killed an Egyptian. And his people, Israel, they didn't want him. They didn't accept him as a prophet back then. And the Egyptians wanted to kill him. So Moses had no intention at all of ever returning to Egypt. No, it was Jacob. And here we see again a mixing between the story of the Quran and Moses and Jacob in the Torah. Furthermore, we see further support for what is in the Torah. We see further support in the prophets. So even in the time of the prophets, the story of Jacob and Moses was kept separate, where it concerns the women. Read along in Hosea 12, verse 13. Jacob fled to the region of Syria, Haran, southern Turkey in our time. Israel, that is Jacob's other name, served for a wife, and for a wife he tended sheep. So even 1,000 years later and more, the word of God, the prophets still say that it was Jacob who served for a wife and not Moses. There is another point I want to emphasize. In the Quran it says 10 to 8 years or 8 to 10 years, however you want to read it. But Jacob's period, that was at least 20 years, and some even say 21 years. So we also see that even the time indications of the service are different. Jacob 21 years. Moses in the Quran, 8 to 10 years. And there too we see a clear difference in the numbers between the two stories. And again, my question is, if the two books have the same author, how can it still be so different and distinct? And how could this mixing have occurred? There is a fourth point I want to show you, because at a certain point it says in the Quran that Moses leaves his father-in-law with his family, and that he travels around and then he comes to Mount Tur, which is Mount Sinai, the Horeb. And there he sees a fire, and then he turns aside, he turns away, and he goes to look, and then God speaks to him with a voice. This is what the Quran says. Let's compare that with the Torah. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. He led the flock beyond the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. When Yahweh saw that he had gone over to look, Elohim, God, called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. At the moment we read this passage in Exodus 3, is it then in the Torah that Moses' family is with him? The answer is no. Moses was there alone with the flock. And there he has an encounter with God. And 5 times the prophet of God says that he does not want to listen to God. He does not want to go. Because God says, you are appointed to make my name known. I am appointing you on a mission to deliver the people of Israel. And I appoint you to go with miracles and signs, and to bring judgment upon Pharaoh. And 5 times Moses refuses, because he's afraid the people won't accept him. He knows he's wanted for murder. He never wants to go back. And as we saw in the previous point, he hadn't agreed on a period, and he performed no service for his wife. He planned to stay there forever because he couldn't go back. But it was only because of God who gave him the command 5 times, and even that, God's anger burns against Moses as he continues to resist. Because he won't go, God's anger burns and says, and you shall go. And in the end, he goes. How did that end up in the Quran then? That Moses serves his 10-year period and then wanders with his family, and after the service ends up at Mount Sinai and has an encounter with God there. That is once again Jacob. When Jacob had finished his service, he said to Laban, "I want to go now. I want to leave." And he secretly slipped away without Laban noticing. And while he's wandering with his family, who appeared to him then? A man. And who is that man? That is God. And he gives him the name Israel instead of Jacob. And we see again that in the Quran, elements of Jacob are added, who wanders after his service and then has an encounter with God. And not Moses, because Moses didn't have his family with him when he wandered. Now, in this history, and there are many more differences, but these are the main differences between the Torah and the Quran. The Quran says that both are books of God. It also says the stories were still accurate in Muhammad's time from the Torah, and that Muhammad's retellings are exactly the same down to the details. How is it then that those claims clearly are not correct? Because I have a Torah here that is 800 years before Muhammad, the Dead Sea Scroll Torah, of which 15% of the Torah has been preserved. And we have Torahs that come after, all of which are still before Muhammad. And in all those Hebrew manuscripts, it is stated very clearly. The story of Jacob, as I have described it, and the story of Moses, apart, at least 300 years apart, in different parts of the world, one in southern Turkey and the other in northern Arabia. Two different people. So how can it be so different then? If the Quran claims it's the same down to the details, that it can resolve doubts, that the Jews can go to the Torah, and resolve doubts when it comes to Muhammad's retelling. And if we then take a look, those doubts turn out to be justified. Because what has the Quran done? It has mixed up Jacob and Moses with each other. And maybe you think, well, the Torah has become corrupted. Okay, let me go along with these thoughts. Has the Torah become corrupted on this point of Moses and Jacob? Because what we'd have to assume is both the history of Moses as it originally stood. Was it written there as it is now in the Quran? And then Jews, at some point, in some way, turned this into two separate stories. So they pulled these two people apart, pulled the details apart, wrote a whole new story for Jacob, because this story of Jacob isn't in the Quran. How he went to Laban and married two daughters. And so they separated those things. Now, you don't do that by accident. You have to do that on purpose. Then you must really want to corrupt, falsify, or change the text on purpose. Why would a Jew do that? Right? What could be a reason for a Jew to do this? Let's go through 4 hypothetical reasons. 4 possible reasons, 4 possible motivations. Because you must be very strongly motivated to change the Word of God. Because you know you're putting your soul at stake. Right? If God is going to judge you for these kinds of errors, then you'll be condemned to hell. So then you must really have a very big motivation to do that. Can we find that motivation? That you would change this on purpose? Do we see a prophecy of Muhammad in these texts? No. Do we see a financial reason to change this? No. I see no economic reasons to separate these people and make a completely different story out of it. Do we see an ethical reason, or is a law being given? No, we don't see that either. Do we see a theological reason? Well, the prophets. They are also clearly portrayed with their faults in the Torah, such as that Jacob deceives Laban. We see that Moses kills an Egyptian. And all of that is told honestly in the Torah. So if you were to change it, then I would say, then make the lives of the prophets a bit nicer and cover up their mistakes. Or pretend that those mistakes never happened. But the Torah doesn't do that. And that's exactly what indicates its reliability, that the bad things are also mentioned. And besides, do we have evidence in the manuscripts that the Quran story was ever in this place? No, we have no evidence. We don't know who changed it. We don't know when it was changed. And we also don't know how it was done. All the evidence we have from the oldest documents in Greek, in Hebrew, all say the same thing. History of Jacob, 300 years. History of Moses, apart. And exactly the same details. And then comes the Quran 2,000 years later. And it conflates the two people. So if we can't find any evidence for the accusation and the claim that this has been changed, then it hasn't been changed. And if it hasn't been changed, then the forgery was done by Muhammad in the Quran. And the Quran is not from God because it deviates on this point from the word of God.